always do, we'll do some singing as people come on. I'll sing the nigun first, and then we'll add the words. Ding 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 ding, under the ding 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 ding, under ding ding ding, under the ding ding ding, under ding ding ding, under the ding 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 ding, ding 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 ding, under the ding 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 ding, under the ding 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 ding, hi ding ding ding, under the ding ding ding, under ding 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 ding. Ding 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 ding, ding 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 ding, v'havienu l'vatzion, yircha b'verina, v'havienu l'vatzion, yircha b'verina. Yerushalayim, Beit Mikdashcha, Oy v'simchat olam. Yerushalayim, Beit Mikdashcha, Oy v'simchat olam. V'havienu l'vatzion, yircha b'verina, v'havienu l'vatzion, yircha b'verina. B'Yerushalayim, Beit Mikdashcha, v'simchat olam. B'Yerushalayim, Beit Mikdashcha, v'simchat olam. Ding 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 ding, under the ding 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 ding, under the ding 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 ding, under the ding ding ding, under the ding ding ding, under the ding 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 ding, ding ding ding, under the ding ding ding, under the ding ding ding, under the ding 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 ding, hi ding ding, under the ding ding ding, oh, under the ding ding ding, nine 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 nine
numbers are going up. Dangerous situation. Stop giving the vaccine. Stupid, dumb people.
Okay. We called this class today Yocheved. Miriam. Could everyone mute themselves? That would be really good at this point. At the end of the class, we unmute and everyone can ask questions. And is Yafa there?
Hi, good morning. I'm here. Yes.
Hi. Is it okay if I record?
I'm recording it.
Okay. Okay.
It's going.
That's fine. Great.
Okay.
Okay. So we called it Yocheved, Miriam, and Bat Paro, a complex triad. It's going to take us a little while to explain why we called it this. But what we're going to do is we're going to have like a first stage of just going through the three women. And like we always try to do, we try to bring new ideas because we're assuming that people know the basic stories. So you don't need us to go over the basic stories, the basic Rashis, the Midrashim that many people know, even though we have to mention that. But the idea is that we want to add new insight and hopefully new ideas that might not be as familiar. And so we'll start with Yocheved. And of course, there's a lot to say about Yocheved, but in our first time through, I want to just pick up on a number of numbers that are mentioned in relationship with Yocheved. They're highly symbolic. So the first one is, we're told at the end of Parshat Vayechi that 70 souls went down to Egypt. And this number is very, very significant because it corresponds to the 70 archetypal nations. It corresponds to the 70 elders, the 70 rabbis who sat on the Sanhedrin, the 70 languages. So the number 70 is very, very significant. But the commentaries point out that only 69 names appear in the Torah. So who was the 70th soul? So according to tradition, it was Yocheved, that she was born literally as they came into Egypt. So she wasn't mentioned because she wasn't born yet, but as they enter into Egypt, she is born. So she is the 70th. So there's something very, very special about Yocheved, that she was in a sense, the completion of the 70 souls. Now, according to tradition, she gave birth to Moshe when she was 130 years old. So we're going to look at the significance of that, because today we're going to see like two different faces of the Torah. One is the archetypal, and one is the very human, the very psychological, emotional, that we will get to later. But what's the significance that she was 130 years old? Before we do that, I'm just going to mention that the Torah says that Moshe was 80 years old when he stood at the burning bush, and he came back to Egypt in order to redeem the Jews. So that means, according to this, Yocheved was 210 years old at that point. And by tradition, she lives even longer. She lives even longer. So in Yocheved's life, we see, in a sense, the whole story of the exile and redemption, because we're told that if she was 130 years old when she gave birth to Moshe, and she was born as they came into Egypt, and he was 80 years old, so if you add 80 to 130, you get 210 years. And this is the prophecy that Yaakov had, in a sense, not even knowing it, when he said to his sons, "Redu, go down." And Rashi even brings a gematria. Rashi points out that the gematria of Redu equals 210, and that without even knowing it, he was prophesying that his children would be in Egypt for 210 years. But Yocheved's life, in a sense, is broken up into those 130 years and then 80 years until Moshe came back. Now let's go a little bit deeper into the 130 years. So what I'm going to tell you right now, I'm saying in extremely short, concise terms. If anyone would like a fuller version of what I'm going to say, you could get my email from Yafa or Julie, and I'll send you the bigger story from one of my books. We would have to take the whole class on this one point if we really extended it. But this might be a new teaching to people. Some people might know it already. It's maybe one of the most radical teachings from the Arizal. And first of all, he points out that the name Moshe, the three letters of Moshe, Mem, Shin, and He, stand for, the Mem is Moshe, the Shin is Shet, and the He is Hevel. That Moshe Rabbeinu was a reincarnation of Hevel, and Shet was a reincarnation of Hevel also. So it says in the Zohar that the soul of Moshe is present in every generation. So we take this to mean that in the future, after Moshe leaves this world, that his soul will return in the leader or one of the leaders of every generation until Mashiach comes. As we say, Hu HaGoel HaRishon, Hu HaGoel HaAcharon. He is the first Redeemer. He is the last Redeemer. So here the Ari adds, though, that it's not only that the soul of Moshe will come back in every generation, but it was present all the ways back to the beginning of humankind, because he comes from Hevel and Shet. Shet was born after, when Adam and Chava were 130 years old. That's the significance here. And I'm bringing all of this to see that Yocheved was an incredibly archetypal soul, that she brought Moshe into this world at age 130. She was fixing something. What was she fixing? According to the Ari, Adam and Chava had separated physically for 130 years. Marital intimacy. They were not having marital intimacy for 130 years. During that time, Adam was still spilling seed. And the Ari says that from that seed came souls in great need of rectification. And so at the Brit Bene Betarim, the covenant of the pieces, God says to Avram, your seed will be enslaved for 400 years. After 4 generations, you will come back to Israel. So the Ari explains what are these 4 generations? These are the generations of the flood, of the Tower of Babel, of Sodom, and Egypt. And these souls that were manifest or created from the spilled seed of Adam had to go through 4 reincarnations until they could start to be clarified. And Avram, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah, the Avot and the Imahot, began the process of fixing these souls. And so Yocheved giving birth to Moshe at 130 years old is alluding to this whole Torah from the Arizal, that with Moshe and that generation, these souls were ready to be fixed. The souls that were not ready to be fixed were reincarnated into the Egyptians. And those souls that were in the process of being fixed, they became the heir of Rav, the mixed multitude. So what I just told you can be expanded greatly, but this is all to explain the significance of Yocheved giving birth to Moshe at 130 years. Now, I know I just gave over a lot of information, so I'll just offer again, if anyone would like a more expanded, detailed expose of this whole Torah, just get my email and I'll send to you. So like I said, there's much more we can say about Yocheved, which we will towards the end. But now Rachel is going to give over a whole picture of Miriam.
So here's the picture of inspiration that I had when I was studying the Midrash about Miriam and her life. So in the Midrash, it talks about how when she was very young, she was 5 years old, she was assisting her mother Yocheved as a midwife. And because of that, because of, the call of a midwife does not happen at predictable hours. So anytime the night or day, a woman could go into labor and they would be on call. And this little girl, Miriam, was so ill and weakened from that her skin appeared to be yellow. And so that's the beginning of the rosebud. She's compared to a rose in its different phases. So she's just like this yellow rose just beginning to open up. and she's exhausted. And at this point in her life is when she has the chutzpah, the holy chutzpah, to approach her father and say, enough of this separation, as Adam and Chava had separated. So during the time of the terrible decrees of throwing the baby boys into the water, Yocheved and her husband also separated. And so Miriam, this audacious, very bright young girl, approaches her father and says, this is not fair. You're also, causing a gezerah to happen on any possible girl babies that could be born. So at that point, that's when Levi takes Yocheved back and Moshe is conceived. So then we go on to Miriam and her life cycle, and that's where this comes in. And we happen to be this time of year, we were in the north of the country. We stayed for a couple of weeks in Tzfat and toured around the Golan, saw the beautiful Har Hermon with the snow. Let's pray for there to be good rains and snow now on the Hermon, so we'll have drinking water. And we were at the shores of the Kinneret by Rabbi Meir Balanes, and right opposite there is the place where Miriam was buried. So we gave honor to Miriam and Miriam's memory, and she at the Song of the Sea, Miriam goes out and she takes the Tof Biyada, V'tetzena kol nashim achareha ad sof kol dorot. So that's one of the things that we're going to look at about Miriam and going out to sing the song at the sea. So that was like a high point in her life, as like after coming from this low point of being exhausted as the midwife's assistant, and then going into the fullness of singing with Moshe and with the Bnei Israel at the sea. And that's why I brought the tambourine out. There's a custom among many women today to bring a tambourine in honor of Miriam's prophetic vision. She was one of the 7 prophetesses. And she, it says in Masechet Megillah that there were 48 prophets and 7 prophetesses, and Miriam is listed as one of those because of what she said. V'ta'an lahem Miriam, Shiru, she gave them a command. You must sing. And not only that, but the women had this faith that everything was going to turn out all right, because they had to run for their lives after the 10 plagues, and the women packed tambourines, of all things. We had to run for our lives recently. A year and a half ago, there was a terrible fire here in our moshav, and we had to evacuate. We had 20 minutes. And what do you grab when you're on your way out? So the musicians grabbed their guitars. It's like, of course, we're going to sing when this is all over. Okay, and then there was this point in Miriam's life as we move on where Miriam became white. When did she become white? Like a white rose, like kind of pale and washed out again, is when she was confronted by Hashem after speaking up against Moshe. And she had good intentions there. She was trying to make peace between husband and wife, between Moshe and Zipporah. And she spoke about Moshe separating from his wife. And look at this theme that's going through here. Adam and Chava separating, Yocheved and Levi separating. Now Moshe and Zipporah separating. They're different times, different rhythms and times in life. So when Miriam spoke, Hashem confronted her and gave her the tzara'at, which caused her face to become white. Tzara'at is always like a result, a cause and effect of any kind of speaking lashon hara. Whether it is emet or not, when we speak about someone in a derogatory manner, not knowing the whole picture, not giving the full benefit of the doubt, it was like an instant feedback that we used to get. We don't have that any longer. We have to learn the laws of lashon hara to be able to control that aspect of ourselves. But then Miriam went on after she was ill with the tzara'at. She was deathly ill, and her husband, who was Kalev ben Yefuneh, she became like a rosebud, and he nursed her back to health. And in celebration of her recovery, because she was almost left this world from the tzara'at, he brought her under the chuppah And they're the rosebuds decorating the chuppah. And these are all sketched from roses that we have in our yard. So that's a little bit about the life cycle of Miriam.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. The other
Yeah,
stuff I'm doing
okay.
there. I'm just going to get our roses that I just picked.
Okay. Okay. So I just want to point out that if you look at the name Miriam, so if you divide it by the syllable, excuse me, it's Mar Yam, bitter waters. Why is this connected to the name Miriam? Is because when she was, according to tradition, she was 6 years old. There's our roses, our white roses from our yard.
And one yellow rose. And they have a beautiful fragrance. So I'm going to say the bracha. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, borei atzei b'samim.
Amen. Very good. So when Miriam was 6 years old, she stood at the Nile watching her brother, not knowing what would happen with him. And he was saved, but he was then taken into the house of Pharaoh by Bat Paro. And then he has to go into exile. So there was a bitterness there in Miriam. What happened to her brother? And even more so is that she prophesied, as Yocheved was pregnant, she prophesied that her mother would give birth to the Redeemer of Israel. She was, as Rachel pointed out, one of the 7 prophetesses. She already saw, now that the astrologers in Egypt also saw that a Redeemer was about to be born. And that's where the decree comes to throw all the babies in the Nile. They were after really one baby, and that was the future Redeemer. And Yocheved, according to tradition, it wasn't just stam that she put him in the Nile, is because she saw that the astrologers saw that this child would be judged, would have a decree based on water. So when she put him in the water, she was trying to, in a sense, erase the decree because she was putting him in the water. And we're told that he was actually the last baby to be put into the water because the astrologers saw, oh, like we predicted, this baby is going to be put into the Nile. They thought he was going to be killed and drowned, but he wasn't. Later, of course, Moshe did have a judgment with water when he hit the rock, which prevented him from coming into Eretz Yisrael. That was his judgment with water. So the astrologers saw what's called unclear prophecy. So Miriam's name is Miriam. But like Rachel said, when they came to the sea and she led all of the women in song, this was like the Song of the Sea is one of the highlights of Jewish history. Every Shachrit and Ma'ariv, we include some of the verses, Michamocha, Be'elim Hashem, Michamocha Ne'adar B'Kodesh, right from Shira to Yam. And so her name, Mar, gets reversed to Ram, which means high, elevated. So at the Yam, the whole experience of the sea elevated not only all the women, but her own being, which had so much so much bitterness because she didn't know what happened to Moshe. And then 80 years later, he comes back to save the Jews. So you can imagine the transformation that happens. One last thing is, and hopefully we'll get to this, is if you look at her name, it has the word Mayim in it with a resh. Mayim with a resh. And that is what connects the three women we're talking about tonight. Yocheved puts her son into the water. Miriam stands by the water, hope to see what happened, and at her advice, she brings back Yocheved to nurse Moshe for his first 2 years after Paro takes him out of the Nile, and he would not nurse from any of the Egyptian nursemaids. So Miriam, as we all know right in the text, says, should I get a Hebrew nursemaid? Now, Bat Paro did not know that she was going to get Moshe's actual mother. This is part of the complexity that we'll get to a little bit later. And then Bat Paro, she draws Moshe from the water, and she names him Moshe, Min Hamayim Mishitihu. From the water I have drawn him. So here we see that the three women we're speaking about, Yocheved, Miriam, and Bat Paro, are all connected to Moshe, and Moshe's whole being is connected to water, because it says, Ein Mayim Ela Torah. There's no water mentioned in the Torah that's not a remez, a hint to Torah itself. And of course, Moshe is the one who brings down the Torah from Har Sinai. Water always attempts to descend to the lowest point. Fire goes up and water is drawn down. So this connects these three women together. Now let's go to Bat Paro. Remember, the first half of the class is just a review, and then we're going to get into some themes, some very, very important themes that will show the comparisons and the complexities of the relationship between these three women. So Bat Paro, in a sense, is one of the least recognized and appreciated women in Jewish history. Is because if you just read the text and you have no oral tradition, then Bat Paro is an Egyptian woman. She's the daughter of Paro. She raises Moshe, and then we don't hear about her again. That's it. When Moshe leaves Egypt, it's done. But the oral Torah says that she was a very, very high neshama. And when it says she went down to the water to bathe, so one midrash is that she had leprosy, or what we call, then it was leprosy, and she went down to the waters to cleanse herself. But according to the Zohar and other traditions, everyone has the tradition that she converted, that she went down to the Nile to Toivel in the Nile. That was the mikveh. And whether she did it that day or a different day, oral tradition says that she became a Jewess. And not just any Jewess, she came out of Egypt with Bnei Yisrael and went through the 40 years in the desert. And according to the Midrash and the Talmud, she's one of the few souls that entered the Garden of Eden while still alive. There's a list, I'm not sure how many, around 10 souls that entered Gan Eden while still alive. However we understand that. So in other words, she was a very, very special neshama. And the Zohar, in the ancient mysticism, there's a whole section called the Heichalot, the palaces, which describe the heavenly realms and different palaces in heaven. And it's in the Zohar, it talks about one of the highest palaces is called the Heichal of Bat Batia or Bitia, which is Bat Paro. So she's a very, very special neshama. And she's the one who names Moshe. According to the Midrash, Moshe had 10 names, 10, let's call it descriptions of his essence. And yet the only one that we call him by is Moshe. And it was Batia who gave him the name. So where did Bat Paro get the name Batia? We're told that God himself gave her the name. And the Midrash says that you saved Moshe. She did. She saved Moshe. And you gave Moshe his name. He's not your son, but you took him on as a son. So God said, you're not my daughter, but I take you on as my daughter. And God called her Batia, the daughter of God. So it's an amazing midrash, and it points out what an incredible neshama she was. Like I said, if we didn't have the oral tradition and all the midrashim, we have Bat Paro saving Moshe, giving him his name, and that's it. She kind of disappears from the text. Okay, so now that we've done we'll call it a initial review of some of the connections with these three women, there's a very, very unique phenomena that is happening here that involves these three women. And I'm gonna read a pasuk from the Torah. If anyone happens to have a chumash in front of them, it's Perach Bet, Pasuk Yud. It's the 2nd chapter, the 10th verse of Shemot. And it says, Vayigdal HaYeled, and the Yeled is Moshe. Moshe grew up, he started to grow up. V'tiviehu lebat Paro, and this is after Yocheved had nursed him for 24 months, according to the Midrash, and he was brought to Bat Paro, because remember that in the beginning, that was the deal, in a sense, deal she made. You nurse him for 24 months, and then I take him as my son. Vayihila leben, and he was to her like a son. V'tikra shemo Moshe, and she called his name Moshe. V'tomer ki mina mayim mishitihu, because, and she said, because from the water I have drawn him. So I want to point out that it starts with, and Moshe began to grow. He began to grow up. Now the next verse says, Vayehi bayamim hahem, and it was in those days, Vayigdal Moshe. Now he's not called the Yeled, he's called Moshe. And Moshe continues to grow up. V'yetzei el achav, and he went out to his brothers. V'yar b'siv lotam, and he saw their burdens. And then it says, V'yar ish mitzri makeh ish ivri me'achav. And he saw an Egyptian man beating a Jewish man of his brothers. So here we have, it says that he grew up twice. Now the Torah doesn't waste words. Why does it have to say he grew up twice? And what is missing here is something very, very unique, because we know in the Torah that one verse or two verses, the Midrash can have 25 pages about it. There are many mitzvot in the Torah that are given over in just one or two verses. You can have 25 pages in a tractate in the Gemara explaining what this mitzvah means according to the oral tradition. So without the oral Torah, like we just mentioned with Bat Paro, we would be missing so much. we would know actually very little about the mitzvot and how to observe them if it wasn't for the oral tradition. But when it comes to the white space between these two lines, when he was 2 years old, he's brought to Bat Paro. And the next thing it says, and it was in those days. Now, there's two versions how old Moshe was when he killed the Egyptian and he had to leave. One version says he was 20 years old, and the other version is 40 years old.
I heard a 12-year-old also.
Okay, that one I didn't see. Either way, the not only is the Torah missing what happens to Moshe in between, but the whole oral tradition is missing, except for one thing. And that's the famous story probably everyone's heard, is that when Moshe was in the house of Paro, that, and it's an interesting thing, Paro came to love Moshe. And he used to play with him all the time. He knew that he was Jewish because he was circumcised. Moshe was born circumcised according to tradition. And while they were playing, Moshe takes the crown off of Paro and puts it on his head. Bilam was there and says, we told you there would be a redeemer among the Jews, and he's going to take the crown off your head and put it on his own head. And Pharaoh was like, whoa, maybe this is true. And then Yitro, according to the Midrash, there were three advisors to Paro: Bilam, Yitro, and Eov. This is a whole story in itself. But in this Midrash, Bilam is saying, like, you have to kill this child. He's going to take the crown from you. And Yitro said, well, maybe he was just playing. Let's make a test. Remember the story? They brought a shining, glowing diamond, and they brought a glowing coal. And Yitro says if he goes for the diamond, it means he knows what he was doing when he took the crown off your head. But if he goes for the coal, he was just playing. He doesn't know what he was doing. So the Midrash says Moshe was going to take the diamond. The angel Gabriel came and pushed his hand to the coal, and he burned his hand. He intuitively put it to his mouth to like lick it because it was burning, and he burned his tongue, and that's why he had trouble speaking. Except for that Midrash, the second time it says Moshe grew up, it said, and he went out to his brothers. So this is the complexity that I want to introduce here. We don't know how and when Moshe understood that he was Jewish. It's like empty in our oral tradition. When Moshe was with his family for those 2 years, was he old enough to understand that he was Jewish and who his real mother and father were and who his sister was? Or like most of us, we have very few actual memories from when we're 2 years old. Some people have a few selected memories from maybe 2 or 3 years old, but it's very rare. So when Moshe was being raised by Bat Paro, how did he find out he was Jewish? Did Bat Paro, who converted, was she raising him in Paro's house as a Jew? So here, what I'm doing more is just throwing out the complexity of the situation that our oral tradition doesn't really tell us. Did Bat Paro know who his real mother was? Because when Miriam said, I'll bring a nursemaid. She never told him, I'm bringing his actual mother. Did they ever find out who they were in relation to each other, or did they? And if they did, was there jealousy? Was there resentment? Was there appreciation that Bar Paro saved him? Because at that point, it wasn't really possible to raise a Jewish boy. Maybe after that, because that was the end of that particular decree. But I'm just trying to give over the complexity of what may be happening here. I don't have the answers. I don't have the answers at all. But I think everyone can start to imagine, did Miriam resent Bat Paro? Did they ever even meet again? Because Miriam was 6 years old. So many times, let's say we see a 6-year-old, we don't see them again till they're 24. We don't recognize them usually. They've changed so much, we don't recognize them. So, like I said, I don't have the answers, but these three women are intrinsically linked together. But the oral tradition leaves a huge, in a sense, white space between the verses as to what their actual relationships were. Okay, so that's one idea. There's another very, very interesting idea, because I touched on it before. And again, we have to do this fairly quickly, but it's very, very fascinating. And this is a Torah from Rav Ginsburg. And I mentioned before, if you take the name Miriam, so first we interpreted that as to being Mar Yam, the bitter waters, that became Ram Yam, the elevated sea. But you have all the letters from Mayim in Miriam and a Resh. And so Rav Ginsburg points out, and this amazing thing, that 10 super important women in Jewish history all have a Resh in their name. Now, it doesn't mean that every important woman in Jewish history has a Resh, but he points out that this is something that is common to 10 different women that have a Resh in their name. What is the significance of Resh? We don't have really the time to go into it, but Resh means Rosh. Resh, Rosh. And we have this saying from Chazal that Bina Yitera Nitna Leisha Yoter Meish, that an extra portion of understanding, Bina, was given to women more than men. And so this is the Rosh. This is the Rosh. We have the idea, Eshet Chayil, Ateret Bala. The woman of valor is the crown of her husband. So that's the idea of the Rosh again, the Ateret Bala. And the Resh, Kabbalistically, has to do with the sphere of Malchut, of kingship. Now, this might come to a surprise to many people, but Malchut is actually is a feminine concept. Even though we usually think of kings, the Book of Kings, David HaMelech, but the soul of Malchut is feminine. And that's why Shabbos is the 7th day. Malchut is the 7th of the lower Sfirot. And Shabbos is the Shabbos bride. So the women are always connected to Shabbos, and Shabbos is connected to Malchut. So I'm going to go through the 10 names of the 10 women. If anyone wants to write them down. I think I can hold this up for
Yeah.
people to see. I
Right.
can't.
I can
can't.
see it.
Okay, here we go.
Oh,
Okay,
there.
okay,
That's
here we go. So it is in Keter. Yeah, we're not going to go through the Kabbalistic intentions here, but in Keter it's Sarah, in Chachma it's Rivka, in Bina it's Rachel, in Chesed it's Miriam, in Gevura it's Devorah, in Tiferet it's Sipporah, Netzach is Tamar, Hod is Ruth, Yesod is Rachav, and Malchut is Esther. All of them have a resh in it. So it's an amazing thing. So here we're making connections between Yocheved, Miriam, and Bat Paro, but there's this whole idea of these 10 women all connected by resh. And in the Zohar, it says, Chachma Yesad Barta. Chachma establishes the daughter. Who is the daughter? Malchut. And the resh has to do with Chachma. Reshit Chachma Yirat Hashem. The beginning of wisdom is the awe and fear of God. This establishes Malchut is the daughter. So that's just a very, very interesting thing. Now, before Rachel comes and gives one more very, very important idea. Well, you know what? To make sure that we have time, I'll let Rachel introduce this idea.
Okay. So we talked
You have to
about
move over.
we
so
talked
your face is in.
we talked about Miriam being Mariam, but this is the sweetening of Miriam is this vision I had of the well of Miriam, that actually she was the source of water in the desert for the 40 years of wandering. And the Midrash talks about how the Nasi'im, when they would come to a new encampment, would go to the well of Miriam, which was shaped like in a hexagonal shaped, and they would take their staffs and they would draw a line, and the water would flow from the well of Miriam as a demarcation line between each of the tribes. And it said that if a woman wanted to visit a friend of hers from a different tribe, she would sail on a little boat across the waters that would flow out from the well of Miriam. And the waters would instantly create these fruitful fields of grain and of the Shivat Aminim all around the encampment, so there would be plentiful food, which was not mentioned because of the man was like took precedence, but this was like an additional bonus that the well of Miriam had. And then when Bnei Israel came into Eretz Yisrael, the well of Miriam rolled into the Kinneret and became the source of drinking water for the Holy Land. And we used to sing a song. One of the 10 songs that was sung is Ali Be'er Enula. Was the Bnei Israel would sing the song about the rising up of the waters of Miriam. So it says the Lefum Tsara Agra, according to the pain and the suffering is the reward. So the women were the ones who suffered the most from the decrees of Pharaoh, and despite the decree of Pharaoh, the women used to use their copper mirrors to entice their husbands to come and be with them, even out after a day of slave labor in the fields. And the copper mirrors were almost rejected by Moshe. He said, these are articles of vanity. So the Midrash says that the women were like shchora ani v'nava, and the women were like the Klal Yisrael is always the feminine. The people of Israel in relationship to God being the masculine force, and women and the people of Israel the feminine receptive force. But Moshe was convinced to accept these copper mirrors because through them, the Bnei Israel, Rabu, Ve'paru, Ve'yishritzu, B'ma'od ma'od, that the women continued their faith that everything would turn out all right and we should continue having these children and build the families of Israel, despite the suffering, Lefum Sarah Agra. So according to their pain and their suffering of the women, seeing their babies plastered into the walls or thrown into the Nile, the women were rewarded by not participating in the golden calf, not believing in the spies, reports about the land being a difficult place, but saying, no, we will go. And the women all entered the land. And despite all of the struggles and the challenges, the power of the women's faith took us into the land. And so it is Ad Hayom Hazeh that the transmission of Judaism comes through the mother.
Okay.
So it says also a kol min ha'afar, that the women encouraging their husbands was like an important part of the geula. And even now, today, in our strange situations that we have, the women holding down the fort, keeping the household going under these unusual circumstances that we have, is a kol min ha'afar, everything that comes from the earth. The afar is always compared to malchut. Malchut, again, is the feminine receptive sphirot. It corresponds also to the name of Hashem, Yud Ke Vav Ke. The Yud being Abba, the He being Ima, the Vav, the son, the He being the daughter. So that's Chachma Yisad Barta is like also the flow that goes from the whole family unit being uplifted. And so may we merit to see the Geula Shlema, the complete Geula, and the merit of the Nashim Tzidkaniot, and that Miriam actually commanded the men. It says, V'ta'an lahem Miriam, that she was the prophet to command the men to sing as well, and at the Song of the Sea. And this month of Shvat that we're coming up to is Rashi Tevot, Simcha, Bracha, Tov. And I also want to add briut for the bet, because we all need the blessings of good health. Those of us who can take the vaccination, those of us who are not able to take it for various reasons, may we all be healthy and restored as Miriam was when she became like a bride again, a rosebud. At the end of her life, her husband Caleb nursed her back to health. He was 40 years her junior, but he loved her with that kind of an undying love. And so there'd be love and harmony in the families that are enclosed together at this very unique time. And the Yud Ke Vav Ke shining through us. And the month of Shvat is special to us because we met on Tu B'Shvat. We met at a Tu B'Shvat Seder at Har Zion, where Avram was in the Kollel there. He was studying, learning Torah. And I was teaching art in the public schools of Yerushalayim. And there was a Brit on Tu B'Shvat at Har Zion. It was our friends, the Teichers, who had their baby boy whose name was Ephraim. And then about a year and a half after we got married, we moved to the Moshav, which is in the Nachala of Ephraim. It's the root word is Pru Urvu. And so when we had our son, we had a daughter first, and then we had a son. It was like they're Makayim, they're according to some opinions. And once you have a son and a daughter, you fulfilled the mitzvah Pru Urvu. And we're living in the Nachala of Ephraim. And it's the month of Shvat, where we're going to be seeing thousands of people coming out here to our forest that was burned a year and a half ago by arsonists. We see it rebuilding, restoring itself. We're seeing the flowers coming up, the wildflowers. We're seeing amazing roses in the month of Shvat. It's like incredible that it was so warm that we had these roses. And a time of the flowing of the sap again, rising up in the trees. It's like the tree of life May we all see it, have good health, good strength, blessings.
Amen.
Good
Amen.
Chodesh.
I'm glad Rachel pointed that out, because this is technically a Rosh Chodesh series, but it's actually
It's the
rare.
first time that we're actually
it's-
broadcasting on Rosh Chodesh.
Right, right. Okay, so we have 5 more minutes, and then we're going to do like we usually do. Anyone who wants to unmute and ask a question, make a comment, add something. But in the last 5 minutes, I just want to point out, again, it's kind of mission impossible to this whole idea, but there's a lot of what's called Mida Keneged Mida happening in everything that we talked about today. In the Mishnah of Sota, when it talks about all the different elements that went into the, let's call it the ordeal that a suspected adulteress was put through. So Rashi points out, the Talmud points out, they were all Mida Keneged Mida. Each of the elements of what she went through was connected to some Mida Keneged Mida. So in the Mishnah of Sota, it continues that idea. And it's the most explicit place of talking about Mida Keneged Mida. And it says, the 2 examples that it brings is Shimshon, Samson, because he went after his eyes, he had his eyes put out. And Avshalom, because he glorified in his long hair, that when he rebelled against his father, he actually died because of his hair, because he was trying to escape, and his hair got caught in the branches of a tree, and they were able to catch him. But then the Mishnah then continues and says, Mida Keneged Mida is not just for bad things, it's also for good things. And what's the example they bring is Miriam. And the example is because Miriam stood on the banks of the Nile to see what would happen to her brother. When she got Sara'at, all of Israel would wait for her, because she had to go outside of the camp, would wait for her for a whole week. Now, the Balaturim points out that the verse where it says that Miriam stood on the banks of the Nile to see what would happen to Moshe has 7 words. And the verse that that the people waited for Miriam when she went out of the camp also has 7 words. So it's brought down that that's an illusion, that they waited for 7 days for her until she could be purified. But that's the example that is brought for Mida Keneged Mida. So it's very significant that it's Miriam, of all the examples that they could bring. And if we had time, in these 3 women, there's so much Mida Keneged Mida. Like, for example, the midrash that we brought of how God came to name the Bat Paro Batya. It was a Mida Keneged Mida, because you took him on as a son and named him. Mida Keneged Mida, I take upon me that you're my daughter, and I'll name you Batya. So that's one example. And the whole thing with water, we mentioned that Moshe, the astrologers saw that he would be judged by water. And we see that later he was. But the Midrash says in the plagues, when it came to turning the Nile into blood, and when it came to the frogs, so Moshe said, it's hard for me to hit the water because water saved me. I was saved on the water. So like it was like a Mida Keneged Mida, because the water saved him. How could he hit the water? So instead of Aaron did it. And the Midrash says all 10 plagues were mida keneged mida. It goes to every plague and says why there were lice and why there were boils and why there were animals. Each one was a mida keneged mida for something that they did to afflict the Jews. The two most important ones is the first one, that the water of the Nile turned into blood because they drowned the babies in the Nile. And the last one, the killing of the firstborn, also is for the same reason, because God calls Israel, you are my firstborn. And because the Egyptians killed my firstborn, that will be the last plague. And we could go on and on, especially with the 4 generations that the Ari talked about, where the souls were reincarnated until they could fix themselves and come out of Egypt. That there was all this mida keneged mida happening. The one that I'll mention is the Torah mentions a couple of times that we had to make bricks and mortar. Well, if you remember, one of the generations where the souls were being reincarnated was the Tower of Babel. And it says there, how did they build the Tower of Babel? With mortar and bricks. And so part of the tikkun that the Jewish people had to go through was to fix all these 4 generations, all the misdeeds that they did. The Jews were able to fix it. The Egyptians weren't. And so that became the classic exile and redemption paradigm. Those souls that could not fix themselves, and the Jewish people that began the process. We're still in the process. We are still in the process of fixing. This goes back to eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. It's a whole
Candy's cake.
Yeah, it's a whole thing. So
right, the sense of the month of Shvat is the sense of eating. So when we eat with mindfulness and we say a bracha on our food, we are going all the way back to Gan Eden and fixing the crooked eating that we did at that point.
Right, that's one of the secrets of the whole month of Shvat, and especially Tu B'Shvat. The whole thing of Tu B'Shvat, of the eating, is to fix the eating of Eitz Hadat Tov V'Ra. So just like my wife ended with a bracha, end with a bracha on Rosh Chodesh Shvat, I have to mention one more thing. According to tradition, according to Rashi, Moshe Rabbeinu began Mishnah Torah. The book of Devarim begins on Rosh Chodesh Shvat, and the entire book of Devarim takes 37 days. 37 is Gematria Halev, the heart.
Halev HaYehudi.
Yeah, so we have this idea of words that come from the heart, enter the heart. So this was Moshe Rabbeinu giving over everything in his heart to all future generations. And it all began on Rosh Chodesh Shvat, Mishnah Torah. So we should merit to receive the Torah that Moshe gave over to us. And we should acknowledge and appreciate that in the schut, in the merit of the holy women, we came out of Egypt. So we just touced on the great deeds of Yocheved, Miriam, and Bat Pharaoh. And on their merit, we came out of Egypt. Okay, so anyone who would like to unmute and ask a question, make a comment, add something, please do, one at a time.
Thank you very much. It was so beautiful and so inspiring. I think that the symbol for the month of Shvat is a bucket, dli.
Yes, great connection.
Receiving, is that the act of receiving the Torah? A bucket is a container, right?
Yes, dli. In Hebrew, it's Aquarius. This is the month of Aquarius.
Julie and me.
It's called dli.
Leaf.
So you're right. This is the proverbial water carrier in Hasidic stories, but it's really talking about the Jewish people. The mission of the Jewish people is to receive the water of Torah, ein mayim el Torah,
And then pour it out.
and to pour it out for the whole world.
So it's not just holding it like stagnant water. It's
Got
a
it.
flowing process.
Yeah, thank you for making that connection.
Beautiful.